But equity, if we were to achieve it, would look like more diversity in our communities. It would look like secure housing and food for everyone. It would mean that the police, if we don't defund and abolish them, but let's say they're still around in our best case scenario, it would look like their arrest and charging data is actually reflective of the population percentages in this region rather than disproportionately representing people of color and poor communities. And so this is a hard question, and I appreciate that we're starting out with it because it is so big.
And definitely a tough question. I definitely appreciate it. Dr. Armeline, what are your thoughts here?
As usual, I really appreciate what my colleague Zahra had to say. I really like that she went immediately to talking about what we would call structured inequalities, right? Or these inequities that don't happen to exist, but they're there because of the built-in features of the systems that reproduce them with some level of consistency, whether that's for poor people, the immigrant, undocumented folks, African Americans, whoever. And so I think, I guess what I want to say is that I want to kind of caution us against being limited to language like equity and diversity and these sorts of things, because I think what we've seen is that doesn't really bring the goods. It is very easy for me to diversify an extraordinarily exploitive system, which is what indeed we have. That explains our criminal justice system. That explains, frankly, every major public institution we have. Yet they remain absolutely fundamentally problematic. And so I don't really like to think about equity, frankly. What I like to think about are the actual social systems that we study and we know exist and we know how they work, and then use those understandings to dismantle and replace those systems. Equity is a really interesting thing, because equity, when it comes to what exactly? I mean, are we saying equity in terms of finances? Because then we got to get into capitalism. Are we saying equity in terms of opportunity? Well, opportunity for what? To exploit another person? To be exactly the person that I'm trying, or the system I'm trying to replace? So I think these conversations about equity and diversity, without any conversation about what it is we're diversifying or what it is we're providing opportunity to, and in what context, can be, let's say, a little frustrating. Yeah.
Absolutely, very thoughtful, very thoughtful. Shava, give us your thoughts here.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Ramona and Josh, for inviting me. It's quite an honor to be in the company of such personalities as all of you. For me, equity as such continues to be only a concept. It is true that in recent years we have been talking a lot about equity in Silicon Valley, so much that the city of San Jose and the county have opened offices and departments dedicated to deal with racial equity. However, the economic, educational, and social gaps that separate poor people and people of color from the privileged classes are still too great. I don't really believe that they can be solved by bureaucratic solutions. I came to the United States back in 1968, and I worked in the fields for the first 12 years until 1979. And, through the United Farm Workers, we were able to negotiate, to organize, and to negotiate some of the best contracts ever for farm workers at the time. 40 years later, I go back to Watsonville or to Salinas, and the conditions and the wages that people have to work under, right, in the fields, we don't have to go too far. All we have to do is go to South County, and you can see, how farm workers live. So it is, it's a good concept, and there's a lot of things that we need to do to make it real. But at this point, for me, it's just that a concept.
Thank you, Shava. And Latoya, I'm going to you. It looks like you were moving. I see the seatbelt around you. So if you're moving, thank you for having the seatbelt on. What's your thoughts on the question,
Yeah,
Latoya?
absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me on here. It's an honor to be among such great leaders and thinkers. Yeah, so in terms of equity, I think it's twofold. One, it's like taking a look at the gaps that we have and creating access points for people that don't have opportunities. And I feel like that's an easy place to start, especially right now when we're so close to election season and we have Proposition 16 on the ballot, affirmative action, Proposition 17, giving convicted felons the right back to vote. And we know who that population is, right? So the Racial Justice Act, which is about to get heard by Senate in a couple days, declaring racism and public health crisis, right? Juneteenth becoming an official holiday. So there have been things that are happening to kind of start addressing these systemic issues. And I feel like when it comes to equity and thinking about how we can make San Jose a place where everyone feels represented and everyone feels valued and everyone feels like they have access to opportunities, it's starting here where there's these resolutions on the table and getting people out to the polls and people using their right to vote to really start addressing some of these systemic issues. So that's what I think about it. I'm like, look, we got these measures on the ballot that are going to address a lot of these issues. We've been organizing to get SROs off of school campuses, pushing to replace the juvenile justice system with systems of restorative justice and support. There's a lot of boots on the ground right now. So I think like when we're talking about equity, we need to be making sure that we're throwing our support and our energy and capacity behind, things that are already in motion in terms of policy.
Thank you, Latoya. I'm glad that you brought that up. I was here when 209 was on the ballot under the Wilson administration. I remember the divisive nature of what it did, and look what it's resulted in. So we really do have an opportunity to put the boots back on the ground. Well, I want to go back to you for the second question. One of the things you talked about was that you can't diversify an exploitative system and basically be able to get the results that you want. So the question I have for you, what are some of your ideas or strategies on how our institutions can elevate the voices of affected people?
So I should probably be responsible and answer as the director of the Human Rights Institute. So and I do appreciate the question, and it's something that we take very, very seriously as an institute. I take very seriously as a teacher, and we write about it, we talk about it, and it's a concept that we did not coin, but it's been around for a while in critical scholarship called praxis. And so that's the way we think about our work, is we as scholars engage in praxis in partnership with our students and our community stakeholders. And that's a real nerdy word to mean something actually pretty simple. And all that really means is that we partner with and listen to the people that, go figure, we actually serve as a public institution. And we accompany them in their struggles to take on social problems that we feel like it's our job to help them to understand. We play our role in that. We do our job as intellectuals, as researchers, as scholars. We help them to discover things along the way. We also listen to them and help them to shape scholarship at the same time. So as you can imagine, it basically means that we see our job as scholars through these kinds of social problems as informing the ways forward, but we also see our responsibility to be down there in the streets and to be there with our stakeholders, to take those risks and to learn from those experiences as well. And that learning goes back and forth. Now, beyond that, beyond like my personal role as a professional, I really am hoping actually that the worst nightmares of the right wing, and I mean this literally right now. So I think it was yesterday or last night, Tucker Carlson on Fox, spin his little bow tie off, freaking out about things as he usually does, trying to hop up the base. And he said, these rebellions, they're not really about racial justice. They're about class war. And, my first thought was actually, if only we were so lucky. So our move right now is that we really have to start thinking hard about where all of this goes in terms of rebellion, momentum, and energy before the forces that are already, frankly, reappropriating it finish the job. And the beauty is, I think that is actually happening. The problem is that I think we read too many really clean, neat history texts about previous periods of rebellion or resistance, where we think it's this really neat process that happens by a really disciplined narrative where everyone's following one leader and believe the same thing. Like, these things are messy. So my hope is that out of the messiness, something like multiracial movements that are both anti-racist and anti-capitalist, or at least pro-union, develop out of this. Because if history is a guide, those are really the only kinds of movements that have brought lasting power to any of those populations, whether it's African Americans, working class people, et cetera.
I definitely agree with you. I think we're at a moment in time where the opportunity is right now and has to be taken advantage of. So I definitely appreciate those thoughts. I was going to say, I know you said you wanted to be responsible. I want to know what the irresponsible answer was, because I'm telling you, that's what everyone here wants to really hear about. So I want you to think about that. I know you from your NAACP hat, so I definitely would like to have you word what are those hats and some of the answers. I want to roll over to you, Zara, because one of the things that you had talked about in your opening was about policing and equity in policing and the treatment of individuals. So I want to roll over to something that's recently happened in a Facebook group involving current and former San Jose police officers making racist jokes about a Muslim woman pulled over in Los Angeles. Why do you think racism exists in local police departments, institutions that we depend on to protect us? And what can local governments do to combat racism in these departments? Let's hear your thoughts.
Wow, always with the big questions, Rick. I'm just like, how am I supposed to fit this in bite size? But, appreciate the opportunity to address that. Frankly, racism is integral to the way policing exists in the United States today, right? Like that is where it comes from. It is the original slave catchers. It's the protectors of the rich in the North. And so, when the roots are bad, right? Like we talk a lot about like the what is it, like one rotten apple? It's like, no, it's not one rotten apple. It's rotten roots from the beginning. And over the course of now many, many years, we've continued to build in protections for really rotten roots. Like you've got a bad tree in an orchard, eventually either you take care of the tree or the whole orchard goes bad. And I worry that where we are with policing today is that it has gone unchecked for so long.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of the story that you're referencing for viewers who may not be familiar, what we learned was that San Jose police officers were engaging in vile, hateful language online. It's offensive, it's horrible, it makes it difficult for someone who looks like me to want to call the police, but my experience is a fraction of what I think many of you have experienced, right? Like, how do I as a South Asian woman be like, oh, well, the police are like harmful to me? Like, no, they're killing Black people on camera without any accountability, right? And they continue to do it. Like, they know that they're being recorded and they do it again. Right? It's like every time we like finish one round of protests, they do it again. And so I don't think that the Facebook issues are actually the biggest issue. The bigger issues is that they are killing people and keeping their jobs. Oh, they retire. Okay, well, they earn more in retirement than I do in a couple of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't even find out. Like, let's use actually San Jose as an example. So we wanted those officers fired. The police officer Bill of Rights makes it so that we can't get access to their HR records. Makes it so that the chief says he can't fire them without like a mediator coming in and making a mess of it. And okay, so maybe they get fired. They just get hired at another department, right? Like there is no accountability at all. And why does this fester? Because there is no accountability. What is it? There's one of these stories about one of the young officers on the George Floyd murder scene. And it's like, he's a youngish officer. It's like his second or third shift. He went in thinking he would change the force. And then he sees one of his trainers doing this, right? And then again, to bring it home to San Jose, we know that one of the people shot point blank in the George Floyd protests was someone who was doing diversity trainings for the police department. And so again, someone does something bad, you stop it, there are consequences, and how you deliver those consequences is one thing, but right now, police are running free with a gun and a badge above the law and terrorizing our communities. And until we can at least name it and then start to say, okay, we're going to take away their money, we're going to take away their power, and we're going to hold them accountable, I don't know that any of this stops.
Okay, we're going to get back to it. I'm going to ask a question about what defund the police means to everybody in the end, and I appreciate you saying that. But I'm going to go to a question again for everyone. I do want to continue to remind the listeners to go ahead and put some questions in the Q&A. I have seen a few questions going. We're going to try to get to those. But this is a question for everyone. We're going to start at the bottom and work our way backwards. So Latoya, we'll start with you and work our way backwards as we did the first round. As community leaders, what are we doing? What are you doing to deconstruct white supremacy in our own spaces? So Latoya, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so for me, my wheelhouse is education and youth empowerment. So I recently was serving as an administrator, and I was working to reform the discipline system in the school. And that discipline system is grounded and rooted in white supremacy and white fragility and white privilege, you know, perpetuating oppression on our students. So just going in there and completely getting rid of all of those suspension and replacing it with relational methods like restorative justice, like guidance, bringing in MTSS. So really just like, I think that was kind of my biggest contribution to attacking that at the systemic level. But then like, aside from that, running DEI programming in education, doing the work with new teachers and doing the work with teachers who have been in their career for 20 years, because everybody needs to continue to shadow work, you know, so we can show the best we can for our students. And I think like made a requirement, right? Like when educators are saying like cultural inclusion and not on a superficial level, this is going to be, there's going to be a way where you're
Latoya, we may be losing you just a little bit. You may be breaking up. Did we lose you? All right, we'll come back to you, Latoya. Why don't we go ahead to Shava?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. You're still coming in a little bit in and out. You may want to turn off your camera. But we'll come back to you if you have anything else to add. Oops, we lost her completely. Shava, why don't we go ahead with you in terms of community leaders? What are we doing to deconstruct white supremacy in our own spaces?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, I mean, the economic, educational, and social gaps that separate the working poor and people of color from the privileged classes are still too great to be solved by bureaucratic solutions. For me, you know, what we need, one of the things we need to do and to continue the struggles in which we've been involved for the last several years. You know, we have to continue to organize our communities. We have no choice. Another thing I think that we need to do is to activate and empower more young people. So we need to have replacements for, you know, people like me who are already set in ways that maybe, you know, and ideas that may be good, but are not, do not apply to the reality that we're living in this, in the present. So, so we need to continue to fight so the working poor get paid a livable wage, you know, that will allow them to live in this valley without having to work 2 or 3 jobs. You know, we need to level the playing field and repeal laws like Proposition 209. Latoya was talking about the opportunity we have with Proposition 616. You know, there's. I had a conversation with a politician a couple of weeks ago in regards to Proposition 16, and his view is that the problem is really the economic gap that we have to solve. But, you know, we're in a capitalistic society where there's always a need for poor people, people with a lot of needs who are willing to work for, you know, anything, just survive. So the economic gap is never going to be closed here, and not in a way that really will allow people to live a decent life. And so if we don't have that, then, you know, we need to at least have other ways that will guarantee that our kids have a shot at getting a quality education.
Absolutely.
So for me, the question is, or the issue is that we need to continue to organize and keep pushing forward.
Yeah. Shava, a lot in what you just said. I definitely agree with everything you
Hello?
said, especially in terms of the wages and conditions and how you talked about it in your first statement, talking about you when you went back to Salinas, the wages and conditions of the farm workers was exactly the same. But Toya, we can't hear you.
Great.
We'll come back to you.
Oh.
I wanted to go ahead and go to Dr. Armeline and see if you had anything you wanted to add here.
So I'll just plug a couple of specific things quickly. So we're working on we're always working on several policy projects, but I'll first of all say that we can only play our role if the organizing that's necessary happens to build power, right? So Chava's absolutely right. Like folks like us can only play our role if we're also building very real power into the communities that we work with and that we're trying to preserve and help forward. So in that realm, we try and then produce policy that is useful for those movements, right, and that address these social problems. So a couple of things we're working on right now. First of all, we are also supporting the Racial Justice Act under Assemblymember Kalra, but we authored another proposal that will also be going out under Assemblymember Kalra later in the year, we think, called the CLEAR Act, and this is something also that NAACP has co-sponsored. And the CLEAR Act is actually going to be set up to, and for many people they're surprised this still has to happen, but to prohibit any law enforcement officer in the state of California from membership or any formal affiliation with fascist or white nationalist organizations of any kind, and that is a lifetime ban. This is, of course, in response to things we've known since 2006 because of FBI and other NSA reports telling us as such. Letting us know that these institutions had long been infiltrated by these organizations. And I think now we're seeing many of the results of that. So one of the stories coming out of the most recent issues of violence coming out of Wisconsin and the rebellions, right, the young man, and I will point out that this is a child, the 17-year-old, a child who was up there with that gun and murdered those people. That in that context, him and other militia members were in full cooperation with police forces. And there is overwhelming video evidence of this here and in these protests and counter-protests all across the country. In other words, it is not a conspiracy theory to say there is considerable cooperation between far-right extremist organizations and our law enforcement agencies. And we think that needs to be explicitly confronted and addressed.
Absolutely. LaToya, I wanted to go back to you to see if you're in a good place, if there's some thoughts that you wanted to finish before we go to Zara.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yep, much better.
All right, awesome. So yeah, just to add on to what I was saying is that, number one, I work within schools to reform their discipline systems to make them systems of restorative justice and resources for students. But then I also run my youth empowerment nonprofit called Youth Hype. And there, the foundation of my program is building self-confidence within students that are traditionally from marginalized communities, and then going from there and teaching them how to organize and how to act in the community, how to take meetings with
Toya, I think we're losing you again. Yep, I believe that we lost it. Zara, why don't we go ahead and go to you to see if we can have you fill in on that question. Give us your thoughts.
There's two things that come to mind that I want to raise up. Is that the first is, being a coming from a second generation immigrant family, among the many things we've got to do to dismantle white supremacy is start to address the aspiration towards whiteness that many of our families live through and exhibit. I always point to the example, we were in a social justice family, but we watched Cops growing up, and we just thought, like, hey, like, bad guys get in trouble, like, don't get in trouble, you won't end up on the show. And we were socialized in our public schools, which were minority majority schools at the time, even, to call 911 if we needed help, right? So deprogramming a lot of that personally and then in our community work has been really key and a priority. It's something that we think about in our messaging, knowing that for a lot of people, hearing terms, for example, like police terror and white supremacy is a bit of a leap out of their comfort zones. If they're first or second generation Arab and South Asian immigrants, that's what we're experiencing. And so having those conversations, finding who's agreeing and lifting them up, amplifying those voices has been key. And then the other part of it is making the connection, because I think the reality that many of us face is that people are busy and time is limited. And oftentimes the question that comes up is, well, why should I care about this? Like, this doesn't impact me. And so making the connection that the way in which white supremacy impacts Black people in our neighborhoods will also impact us today, tomorrow, or at some point in the future. If they can do it to our brothers and sisters, then what stops them from coming for us? And so the way I always explain it is like, it's the right thing to care about. We should be selflessly motivated to want to dismantle white supremacy. You know what? If that's not sufficient, then there's also a selfish motivation, and it's self-preservation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good answer. Susan, why don't we go back to you? Any thoughts here?
Yes. So as a community leader in the Japanese American community, deconstructing white supremacy has to be destroying the model minority. So the model minority strategy to divide people of color was built on the back of Japanese Americans who were being released out of the concentration camps. And so that's almost 80 years of a task that Japanese Americans and now Asian Americans have to take up constantly, because this is a strategy that is constantly being used to humiliate and vilify Black Americans, and to confuse Asian Americans, and also to confuse white people, and confuse everybody basically as to whether racism exists. And clearly racism exists. So I think, so for us, so the formation of the San Jose Nikkei Resistors, which is a grassroots multi-generational organization based in the San Jose, Japan, example of fighting white supremacy through defeating the model minority. The model minority, many people think, has to do with achievement, but it really has to do with political compliance. And so for Japanese Americans who were essentially really crushed by the concentration camps and subsequent actions against Japanese Americans, for us to step forward and to collectively as a community speak out in unity with other people of color, and to fight on behalf of Black Americans, and on behalf of Muslim Americans, and on behalf of Latino Americans, is fighting back against white supremacy. And I think that's a really key thing. And it's very a complex and sneaky strategy that is always trying to undermine unity. For example, for Japanese Americans, we've been doing a lot of public education on the camps for the last 40 years. And there's a pressure on Japanese Americans to look at ourselves as though we were uniquely oppressed. But I think that's a thing that it's really important for people to understand, for Japanese Americans, that we are organizing to take our place among everybody else, because we are a part of this long-term struggle against white supremacy. And the model minority strategy tries to veil that and keep us from understanding that. So that's a really important thing. And so right now, one of the big struggles within the Asian American community is the struggle over affirmative action. And so progressive Asian Americans are coming out in favor of Prop 16, and the debate is on, basically. So.
Yeah, no, indeed, I've seen the debate. Just because one community, the debate is just because one community believes that others will be invited to the party, others will lose. No, we're all at the party together and succeeding together. I can tell you, I'm very much in support, as well as the NAACP is very much in support of Prop 16, the model minority. I'm happy that you spoke to that. I'm going to go ahead. We have about 14 questions that have come in from the community. I'm just going to see if a couple of folks want to kind of take a stab at some of these. Let's start with the first one: is how do we combat the backlash, which is coming from the Trump administration. And then it says, how do we reduce the 40%? Anybody who want to take a stab at that? Shava, I saw you unmuted yourself.
I did. No. How do we reduce the 40%?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to, but in terms of the backlash, which is coming from the Trump administration, I'm assuming that I may have a real one-word answer for everybody, and that's vote. If you want to reduce backlash from the administration, to vote. Shava, anything you want to add on, or anyone else?
Yeah, no, I mean, getting people to understand that in this country, really, it is possible to change things by participating in our democracy. It's key, Rick. Because, I came here in 1968, I was telling you. I didn't become a citizen until 1998. So, and do you know what made me decide that I needed to become a citizen? Because for years, I worked for the Service Employees International Union, mobilizing members to support campaigns for people who were running for office. And then one night in 1998, Cindy Chavez ran for city council. And we had a crew of about 40 janitors knocking on doors and getting people out to vote. 8 o'clock, it was raining, and that election took about 2 months to be decided. The difference was 14 votes. That's when I decided that, heck, we made a difference, and I can make a difference myself if I become a citizen and acquire the right to vote. And so voting is essential for people. Getting involved in politics is something that we all need to do. Politics affect all aspects of our lives, and so that would be a way of fighting back to people like Donald Trump and other people who are just creating division and sowing hatred in our country, Rick.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to go on to another question here. The question for the panel is, has race and class disparity been discussed regarding public transit in Silicon Valley? This person is asking based on two things. A recent San Jose Spotlight report on the San Jose proposal for a high-tech tunnel in Western San Jose, and a proposal from VTA to cut bus and light rail service to levels last seen in the 1970s, months after the opening of BART to Berryessa connection to the richer white East Bay suburb. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? I don't know if we have any transportation experts on there. Is there anyone has any background on this one? I was gonna say I don't either, but maybe it's something that folks can look at. But I don't know that we have the right panel or anyone that's working on this directly for us. So let's go ahead and move to one more question. Then I'm gonna go back to some of the questions that. Now this one is a very interesting one. So I'll look to maybe a couple folks to take a stab at this. Will a new police chief, I'm assuming they mean San Jose, who's a woman, possibly change the systematic male-dominated culture in the force? Any thoughts on that? Anyone want to take a shot?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's Latoya. Go ahead.
Okay. I think that it can definitely be a start to change because of representation, but I think it's going to take more than a person to change the system. So I think a woman can go into that system. However, there is going to be resistance that she's going to be met with too. So there also needs to be that the exact same autonomy given to her that would be given had it been a male that's in that position. Then we can talk about system change.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Anyone else take a stab at that? All right, we're going to go back to another. Shava, I got a question for you here. We're currently dealing with dual crises in America and in our community. Living through a pandemic, Latinos in San Jose account for more than 53% of COVID-19 cases, but make up 25% of the city's populations. African Americans make up 3% of the city's population, but our death rate is 5%. What are some of the root causes that for Latinos and African Americans that were affected so disproportionately by the virus? What are your thoughts?
I mean, Rick, for me, the main one is poverty. Poor people cannot afford to live without work. You know, especially people who don't have a status and who are not entitled to unemployment insurance or any other type of benefits. I think it was Will who was saying that, poor people don't want to go get tested because they're afraid that if they have to quarantine for 2 weeks, what are they going to do? I mean, no money is going to come to their household, and how they're going to pay the rent, and how they're going to be able to buy food for their families. And so poverty is number one. Poverty also creates situations where people have to live, in overcrowding situations. For the past 7 years, we worked with people in the neighborhood south of Tropicana, over by Story and King, Santee, and that area. And, most houses in those neighborhoods, Rick, have at least 2 up to 3 families living in the same household. And so overcrowding is a huge issue, right? Because if you have 3 different families and each of the head of household has to go out to work every night and come back and, bring, the infection back to the household, that is going to, infect everyone. And so overcrowding and poverty for me are the, which is, one is the result of the other. It's the main reason why we have such a high incidence of infections and that the Latino community, Rick.
Absolutely. Poverty is definitely the thing that keeps us from getting the equity. Susan, I want to go to you. You talked a little bit about the fact in terms of what you're looking in terms of the model minority and things that we share a common cause on in the African American communities and other communities. And I know you've been vocal about solidarity between the Black and Japanese communities. What are some of the parallels between the 2 communities, and how do you think you can build solidarity to end white supremacy? I know you touched on it, but maybe there's a little more that you can add. And do you think some of the parallels of the broader Asian community and the Black community? And where do you actually see common cause? What are some of the common fights for civil rights and the removal of institutional racism? I know I packed a lot in there, but please go ahead and take a shot.
Sure, I'll take a shot at that. So I don't look at the Black American community and Japanese American community as having a lot of parallels, but I think that it's more like our histories are intertwined throughout history. So I think the oppression of Black people, is foundational in this country, and it precedes the formation of this country. And the liberation movement for Black people has international prestige. I think Japanese Americans are a very tiny population, and we've been here a little bit over 100 years. But we do have things where we are intertwined. So in San Jose, the largest redlined area is centered on Japantown. And that was a home for Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, as well as Black San Joseans. So that's one way that we've been intertwined. Also, I think, and these are things that a lot of Japanese Americans don't know, but when government issued the order to remove us and to incarcerate us, very, very few people spoke out against that. But the California Eagle, which was a Los Angeles-based Black newspaper, editorialized opposing the incarceration. And as well, Hugh Macbeth, who was a civil rights attorney in Los Angeles, assisted Japanese Americans who by this time were incarcerated behind barbed wire when nativist organizations tried to take away native-born Japanese American citizenship and voting rights. So that's an incident that we were intertwined there. In the 1960s, Japanese American students, along with other Asian Americans, joined with Black and Chicano students to fight for ethnic studies. And that was a hugely important effort to stop the erasure of our actual history in the United States. Another thing that people don't know commonly is that in 1967 to 1971, Japanese Americans led an effort to repeal Title II of the Emergency Detention Act, which was a provision that kept some of the concentration camp sites online and would have enabled mass incarceration of protesters. This was during a time of a lot of civil unrest. And I think that it's pretty clear that the people who would have been incarcerated in those camps that were created by that act would have been African Americans. It also, for Japanese Americans, it was not a surprise to us that Black Americans were the earliest and staunchest supporters of our struggle for redress and reparations. And it was individuals as well as the entirety of the Congressional Black Caucus, as well as the Jesse Jackson presidential campaign that supported our efforts. So, you know, our redress and reparations victory was not complete because of significant denials, especially for Japanese Latin Americans. But we feel it was very meaningful to us. And because of that, we feel that it is our moral obligation to support the passage of H.R. 40, which is the commission bill for reparations for slavery and its aftermath. And it's not just a moral obligation, but we also recognize, because we are intertwined and because we are a part of this larger struggle for equality and for justice, that passing some kind of reparations legislation would be transformative to this country. And it's kind of, you know, something that people have been alluding to, going to the root and dealing with basic systemic issues that have been unaddressed for generations. So that's how I think Black Americans and Japanese Americans are intertwined. And I think that with regard to the rest of the Asian American community, it's there are also historical intertwining there too. And as I said before, one of the big struggles that we're going through now is to try to unite Asian Americans in support of Prop 16.
Absolutely. I believe we share a lot of common cause when it comes to the civil rights community. I want to go back to something that Zara had talked about, and I do want to kind of get the opportunity, maybe for a few of us to answer. And Latoya, I'm going to look you to chime in after Zara. But Zara, you talked about defunding the police. What does defund the police mean to you? I think it can mean something different to a little bit of everybody. Zara, why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Rick, really quickly, can I go back to the question about the possibility of a female police chief?
Absolutely, please. I didn't want to take that away.
The idea that the optimism that representation could, you know, have a substantial impact on our problems is something that I've thought a lot about in the context of, you know, the Arab and South Asian Muslim community. Post 9/11, there's this like, well, what if we just all became FBI agents? What if we joined the military, right? You know, like the FBI is still surveilling our mosques. The military is still invading Muslim majority countries. And we see this, by the way, also, like I forget who has it, but they memed it around all of the women leaders in national security agencies in our country. So we've got like women at the NSA and women at the CIA. Well, guess what? They're still killing people because the agencies are rotten to the core. And, you know, we look, the issue at San Jose PD isn't just misogyny, right? Like it is, if you look at Eddie Garcia, he is, you know, he grew up in a working class family. He's from an immigrant family. He's Latinx, and they're still doing all of this stuff. And if we look at police chiefs across the country, if we look at police chiefs and DAs across the country, we see that skin color, gender, and even sometimes class background have had no impact. That if the institution is rotten to the core, it doesn't matter. If we want to be like really grandiose about it, look at, you know, the Obama presidency. Is yes, he was better than Trump, and yes, he was better than Bush, but like, was he killing people? Was he deporting people? Are we any, like, am I any safer because of his presidency than I was under Bush? I don't know, right? Like, I've had this conversation a lot in the Muslim communities. Like, could we get into a body count about Trump versus Obama? It's potential that if Trump were in office as long as Obama is, we'd end up with more bodies, right? But I don't know that representation alone is going to get us progress so long as we've got institutions like the Police Officers Association, which really is an institution, it's a monstrosity of its own. When we've got the city council protecting them, when we've got these pensions, right? Again, they retire and they continue to collect these massive paychecks. And then the police leadership will tell us, well, we can't do anything because they're retired. It's like, I don't know. So anyways, the list goes on, and I just want to be like, I don't have hope that a female police chief will make a difference if we don't change anything else. Now, what does defunding the police mean? If I were to speak personally, in my dream world, we don't have a state-sponsored terror force running around in our communities with guns and badges and no accountability. Clearly, the second cup of coffee is kicking in now. But right, that's what defunding the police means in Zahra's dream world, is that we don't have people who are above the law, who are terrorizing our communities, period. Right? We've seen over and over again that we can't call on the police to keep us safe. If anyone keeps us safe, as a person of faith, I would say God first and foremost, but then it's our communities. Now, if I'm speaking organizationally, the more responsible position, I think, as someone put it earlier, or the more moderated position, as someone put it earlier, we're looking at budget justice, right? Police budgets are oversized. We are taking money from schools, we're taking money from mental health providers, from social services, and we are asking people, again, with guns, badges, and no accountability, to do all of these other social service things that they are under-equipped, under-trained, and overpaid for. And so budget justice is a step before fully defunding the police that many of us dream about, but know is not possible in 2020 or 2021. And what it would entail is to say, we're going to slash these budgets. They should not be taking as much of the city budgets as they do. And instead, we're going to put those resources to other capacities in our communities. Again, mental health providers, social service providers, schools, to start. And none of those people will have guns, and instead will be focused on building communities rather than sending people to money-making prisons.
Thank you. I want to go to Latoya for that, because Latoya has done a lot for the little Black Lives Matter protest and to aim towards youth. Latoya, talk a little bit about defunding the police, and after you're done, we're going to go into a quick lightning round for everybody. We've got about 25 questions. No, we'll never get there, but I do want to pitch out some questions, see if we can do 30-second answers. Latoya, go ahead. What do you think?
Okay.
So
yeah, just real quick, want to share a little bit about some of the work we did around defund police this summer. First of all, like organizing with family members who have been directly impacted by this. You know, their family members have been killed by police officers, San Jose PD officers who still have their badges, who haven't been convicted, who basically got paid vacations after they murdered community members. And so really working directly with them to think about what are the outcomes, because when we're talking about defunding the police, and here's the misconception, people are like, you're saying get rid of the police. And it's like, no, I mean, of course, that is what we want, because let's get, you know, let's be honest, it's a slave catching system, and slavery still exists. It's just the chains look different, right? So, you know, yeah, of course that's what we want, but that's not what we're saying when we say defund the police. When we say defund the police, we're saying demilitarize our police. There's no reason that San Jose PD should be as a militarized force as it is. It's ridiculous. If you even look at some of the money that goes towards just some of those weapons alone, that could resolve some of the social inequity issues that we have in our community. So when we're saying defund the police, we're saying look at the budget and where you could pull from, and it doesn't necessarily mean cutting people's positions. You could actually do this without laying people off. But it also is twofold, because we're talking about divest and reinvest in the community, but we're also talking about reciprocity and restorative justice, which is providing support resources, and I'm talking about financially, to families who have been directly impacted by this, right? So like, what does it look like to try to repair some of the harm that has been done? So, you know, for us, defund the police was like, number one, like, you know, divest and reinvest in the community, but two, like repair some of this harm that has been done and actually reinvest in how you're training folks, right? And like, so I think, you know, there's that misconception around like just completely get rid of the police, and that's not what defund the police is about. And I actually think it's a pretty generous offer, considering we could have been like, nah, this is revenge. We're getting rid of police, but we didn't. We're taking it slow. So I think like this is definitely, you know, it's definitely one of those things where it has to be a step-by-step process. So we'll see.
All right. Lightning round, just looking at the time here, I got one question I'm gonna probably end here before we try to get into something else, and maybe look for a quick lightning round closing from everyone. The question is gonna be, and I thought this was a good one, what do you wish Silicon Valley tech companies were doing to fight anti-racism and equity? Dr. Armeline, we're gonna start with you. 15 seconds, lightning round.
Redistribute their wealth.
All right. Susan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think they could definitely pay more taxes.
All right. Sava.
Yeah, I agree. Pay their fair share of taxes, definitely.
All right. Zara, any thoughts here?
You might get unanimity on the panel. They should contribute.
All right. Latoya?
Create education pathways for students from socioeconomically disadvantaged communities.
Perfect, perfect. Hey, what I'm going to do is ask everyone to, again, 15 seconds, see if you have any other thoughts in terms of this panel. I'm going to start with you, Susan, do a quick lightning round, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. Susan.
Sure. I think there's a rule of thumb for looking at policies to address police and other inequities, and that's the solution has to have transparency, it has to have accountability, and it has to have public oversight. And the people have to be empowered to engage in the civic process.
All right. Dr. Armeline.
Yeah, I want to just say quickly, in all of these discussions with police, and this touches on Zahra's point about a female chief or diversifying leadership, is what has to be changed and what people are actually in the streets about is the actual power relationship between the police and the policed. Mm-hmm. And the bottom line is, and this is what we're saying about in terms of accountability, they don't answer to us under any stretch of the imagination. And we pay for them and we give them the legitimacy of the use of force at the end of the day. Now, I don't know, and I would just leave this for people to think about. I don't know what it looks like if what we see right now isn't enough evidence for you to show that they've lost their legitimacy on the use of force. If you can watch videos like that of Jacob Blake and say this institution is still legitimate and their monopoly on the use of force against civilians that we give them in dollar and in policy, I don't know what that looks like then. How many people have to be murdered? How obviously, how inhumanely, I literally would like to know from someone who says the line should be drawn somewhere else. Where is that line for you?
Now that's the criminal justice chair of the San Jose Silicon Valley NAACP. Shava, what do you have? 15 seconds.
I think that, there's a need for us to come up with a more universal definition of what defunding the police means, because it depends on, who do you ask? If I ask my members or the member whose house got broken 5 times in the last 24 months, she's going to say, what? No police? We're not going to have police people, in our neighborhood. We need to be able to explain to them what exactly we mean. For me, what it means is to take away from the police the right to continue to kill people with impunity. I just cannot understand why, and that video of what's going on in Wisconsin, why they couldn't just, shoot, this person in a leg or somewhere. There was no need to use more, force, and it's just incredible.
Absolutely. Latoya, final 15 seconds of thoughts.
Vote yes for Prop 16, also for Prop 17 to give convicted felons back their right to vote. The Racial Justice Act is about to get heard by Senate in a few days. Call senators. We know Bay Area, we have progressive policymakers, but we need the other side of California too. So make those phone calls, get folks to support the Racial Justice Act. And just remember that, there's reality and then there's our stories about reality. We have to decolonize our minds, engage in difficult conversation, agree to disagree, but really seek to be collaborative, to be relational and versus being transactional. I think that then we can start to see some change when we start adopting the mindset of it takes our village to raise our community.
All right, and Zara, you're going to be the caboose. You're going to be bringing up the end. What are your 15 seconds in the lightning round?
This is a really long struggle. It's not going to end this week, next week, and frankly, it will continue past this legislative and election cycle. That's what it takes to get real systemic change. And so I know that my co-panelists are in this for the long run, and I hope the attendees will be as well.
All right, and I want to thank the panelists. I've really enjoyed this today, and I'm going to thank everyone else that has joined us today for this important forum. Hopefully you've enjoyed this discussion by our panelists. You know, we will have the recording of this discussion, a recap story available on the San Jose Spotlight website shortly. Before we go, I do want to take a moment to highlight an upcoming event that's going to be highlighted. It's going to be hosted by one of our sponsors, Sacred Heart Community Service. On Saturday, September 19th, Sacred Heart will be hosting their inaugural Solidarity Summit. This virtual event will be an opportunity for folks to come together to live out a vision of solidarity, a community united to end poverty. For more information, visit their website at sacredhearts.org/solidarity2020. I want to thank everybody again for tuning in, and I hope that you're enjoying the San Jose Spotlight coverage, and I'm hoping that you're also making donations to San Jose Spotlight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.